Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a torchlit hall where stone walls sweat with heat, incense hangs low in the air, and you can almost feel the weight of embroidered fabric dragging across the floor as a royal bride takes one slow step forward. You're there, pressed among murmuring courtiers, watching a wedding that looks romantic from a distance but feels strangely tense up close. Everyone smiles, but no one relaxes. You probably won't survive this story with your fairy tale expectations intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, drop your location and local time in the comments, because it's oddly comforting to know who else is half awake with you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there watching, and it slowly dawns on you that this wedding isn't really about the two people at the altar. Not primarily. It's about the way the crowd is arranged, the banners chosen, the exact prayers spoken out loud, and the ones carefully left unsaid. Early royal weddings were not intimate family affairs that accidentally became public. They were born theatrical. From their earliest forms, they were staged as living symbols, meant to be read and interpreted by anyone lucky or unlucky enough to witness them. In the early medieval period, when kingship was still a fragile idea, held together by bloodlines, oaths, and a decent amount of intimidation, marriage became a kind of visual proof. You didn't just rule because you claimed divine favor or military strength. You ruled because everyone could see you binding your lineage to another powerful house. When a king married publicly, before nobles and clergy, he wasn't declaring love, he was declaring stability, or at least attempting to. There's a mainstream historical fact that historians largely agree on. By the early Middle Ages, royal marriages were one of the most important tools for securing alliances between rival territories. You can see this clearly in Carolingian Europe, where marriage ties stitched together a constantly shifting political map. A wedding could end a feud, pause a war, or quietly absorb a smaller realm without spilling a single drop of blood. Cheaper than an army, less messy than a siege, and far more photogenic, well, medieval photogenic, which mostly meant gold and candles. But as you watch the ceremony unfold in your mind, you notice something else. The symbolism is heavy, but it's also directional. It points outward toward the audience. This is not a moment meant to be felt deeply by the couple. It's meant to be witnessed. Royal weddings became crowned theatre, a performance staged for subjects who needed reassurance that someone, somewhere, was still in control. And control was the key word. When power is unstable, it loves ritual. Ritual slows time, makes chaos feel organized, and gives people something familiar to cling to. A wedding procession through city streets, bells ringing on cue, choirs singing words most people didn't understand. These were sensory anchors. You hear the sound, you see the crown, you assume continuity, your brain fills in the rest. It's surprisingly effective even today, especially today, honestly. Here's a quirky tidbit that doesn't always make it into the bedtime history version of events. Some early royal weddings were deliberately scheduled to coincide with religious feast days, not for holiness, but for crowd control. More people already in town meant more witnesses meant more legitimacy. It's the medieval equivalent of dropping big news when everyone's already doom scrolling. Different century, same strategy. As you linger in this imagined hall, you realize that love, actual romantic affection, wasn't just irrelevant. It was potentially dangerous. Love makes people unpredictable. Love encourages loyalty to an individual rather than to an institution. Royal power didn't need soulmates. It needed symbols that behaved themselves. So marriage was designed to look emotionally rich while functioning politically hollow. a beautiful shell, carefully reinforced. Historians still argue whether early monarchs consciously understood marriage as propaganda in the modern sense, or whether the system evolved organically as rulers copied what seemed to work. Either way, the effect was the same. Weddings taught subjects how to feel about their rulers. Stability was married to spectacle, and the crowd learned to associate ritual with reassurance. You start to notice the choreography. Who stands closest to the couple? Who speaks? Who remains silent? Silence especially becomes meaningful. Brides, in particular, were often expected to embody stillness. You can already sense where this is going, even though we won't fully walk there yet. Still, the seeds are planted early. A quiet bride is a controlled bride. A controlled bride suggests a controlled household. A controlled household implies a controlled kingdom. It's a neat little psychological chain wrapped in lace. And yes, before you ask, there were jokes at these weddings too. Feasts, drunken uncles, someone inevitably falling into a fountain, but the ceremony itself was deadly serious. This was not the place for improvisation. Even the smallest deviation could spark rumors. Did the groom hesitate? Did the bride look away? Did someone trip? Medieval gossip travelled faster than you'd think, especially when carried by merchants and clergy who moved between cities like walking newsletters. One of the stranger fringe theories you might stumble across late at night, probably around the same hour you're listening to this, suggests that early royal weddings borrowed elements from Roman triumphs, not in a direct copy-and-paste way, but in spirit. Processions, elevated figures, ritualized clothing, controlled movement through public space. The idea was the same. Power must be seen moving through the world in an orderly fashion. Even joy had to march in straight lines. As the ceremony ends, you imagine the applause, polite, restrained, respectful. People bow, cross themselves, murmur approval. And somewhere deep in the collective mind of the crowd, something settles. The crown feels secure. The future feels, if not bright, at least predictable. That feeling is the real outcome of the wedding. Everything else is decoration. You can't help but smirk a little, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Royal weddings weren't hijacked by politics later on. They were political from the start. Romance was layered on afterward like sugar on medicine, making the message easier to swallow, and people swallowed it gladly because uncertainty is exhausting. There's a gentle irony here. These weddings were meant to project control, but they also revealed anxiety. A ruler confident in absolute power doesn't need elaborate ceremonies. The more fragile the authority, the louder the bells. It's like someone who insists they're totally calm while slamming doors. You notice the contradiction even if no one says it out loud, and as you drift forward in time, still standing in that echoing hall, you feel the story tightening. Because once marriage becomes theatre, once it becomes a language of power, it doesn't stay neutral. It starts choosing sides, it starts shaping lives, it starts deciding who matters and who disappears quietly behind the veil. But for now, you just breathe in the incense, listen to the fading footsteps, and let the image blur slightly at the edges. The stage has been set. The audience has been trained, and control, dressed in silk and gold, has just taken its first formal bow. You move forward without leaving the hall because time here doesn't snap. It stretches. The candles are replaced, the banners subtly change, and the faces around you age and renew, but the core arrangement stays eerily familiar. You start to notice that the language surrounding these weddings sharpens. Words like affection and companionship fade into the background, replaced by heavier terms: blood, house, succession. Love doesn't vanish entirely, it's just pushed so far off stage that no one expects to see it anymore. You begin to understand that bloodlines aren't just family trees. They're political maps drawn inside human bodies. every marriage knot tightens or loosens a claim to land, to loyalty, to legitimacy. When royal families talked about good matches, they weren't talking about chemistry. They were talking about whose grandchildren would rule which valleys, whose name would appear on future coins, whose portrait would stare down from palace walls long after everyone in the room was dust. There's a mainstream historical fact that keeps coming up no matter which monarchy you peer into. Royal marriage contracts often read more like treaties than personal agreements. Dowries are listed in land, titles, or military support. Clauses outline inheritance rights in chilling detail. In some cases, entire wars hinged on whether a marriage produced a male heir within a certain number of years. Romance didn't just take a back seat, it was locked in the trunk and told to be quiet. You feel the tension most clearly when you imagine the people involved realizing what they're up against. A prince raised on stories of duty learns early that his future spouse is less a partner than a strategic asset. A princess, often raised elsewhere, is groomed, politically and socially, to slot neatly into a foreign court where her body carries diplomatic weight. Her womb becomes a bargaining chip long before she understands what that even means. Cozy bedtime thoughts, right? Told you this might sting a little. The idea that love could interfere with this system was genuinely terrifying to ruling houses. Love encourages preference. Preference creates favoritism. Favoritism threatens balance. Balance, in royal logic, was everything. Dynastic stability depended on predictability, and love is famously bad at sticking to scripts. You can almost hear medieval advisors whispering warnings the way modern PR teams warn politicians not to go off message. There's a strange, almost darkly funny tidbit here. In several European courts, matchmaking negotiations included discussions of temperament, but not in the way you'd expect. Gentle didn't mean kind, it meant compliant. Strong didn't mean brave, it meant fertile. Emotional compatibility was irrelevant. Bodily and political compatibility were king, or queen technically, but you get the idea. Historians still argue whether royal couples ever expected happiness as a byproduct of these unions, or whether happiness was considered a pleasant accident at best. Some letters suggest guarded optimism, hope that affection might grow over time, like a plant watered reluctantly. Other records suggest a colder realism. Marriage was work, heirs were output, and feelings were private inconveniences to be managed discreetly. As you drift from court to court, century to century, you notice how bloodlines begin to tangle. Cousins marry cousins, uncles marry nieces. The family tree folds inward until it starts to look less like a tree and more like a knot. This wasn't ignorance, it was calculation. Keeping power pure meant keeping it close. The long-term biological consequences weren't fully understood yet, or were willfully ignored in favor of short-term political security. Future problems were future people's problems. You pause on one familiar image, portraits lining a palace corridor. The faces start to resemble one another uncannily. Same jawline, same distant eyes, same carefully neutral expressions. These paintings weren't just art, they were visual arguments. Look, they said, at the continuity. Look how stable we are. Never mind the migraines, the fragile health, the whispered concerns behind closed doors. Public bloodlines were polished, private realities were hidden, and yet love kept trying to sneak in through side doors. Affairs happened, secret attachments formed. Sometimes they exploded into scandal, sometimes they were quietly tolerated as long as the real marriage did its job. There's an unspoken rule you start to sense. Feel what you want, just don't let it interfere with succession. Romance could exist, but only in designated, politically harmless corners. One of the more fringe ideas floating around among cultural historians suggests that this systematic sidelining of love actually helped romanticize it later. By denying love a place in official power structures, monarchies accidentally turned it into a rebellious ideal. Love became something dangerous, thrilling, forbidden, a thing you read about in poems, not contracts. Control created its own counter-myth, which is honestly very on brand for humans. You notice, too, how the language of blood slowly seeps into the public imagination. Subjects are taught to care about royal children they'll never meet. Births are celebrated with bells and bonfires. Deaths are mourned collectively. The bloodline becomes a shared emotional investment, even though it benefits a tiny group at the top. It's kind of impressive, in a manipulative way. Get people to love the idea of continuity and they'll tolerate almost anything wrapped in it. There's a moment, always, that crystallizes the risk of this system, when a marriage fails to produce an heir. Suddenly, love is blamed, bodies are scrutinized, and whispers turn sharp. Queens are accused of barrenness, kings seek annulments. The same institution that erased personal feeling now demands biological performance. Control giveth, control taketh away. You can't help but notice the imbalance. Bloodlines mattered more than people, but the burden fell unevenly. A king without an heir was unlucky. A queen without an heir was suspect. The system was never neutral, even when it pretended to be purely strategic. And pretending was something royal culture did very, very well. As you settle into this realization, the earlier wedding hall feels different now. The silk and gold seem heavier, the vows echo longer. You understand that when two royals married, they weren't just joining families, they were submitting their future emotions, bodies, and choices to an invisible audience that stretched generations forward and backward in time. This is the quiet brutality of dynastic control. No swords, no shouting, just expectations so deeply embedded they feel like natural law. You're born into a role, you marry into a strategy, and your personal desires become footnotes, if they're recorded at all. And somewhere in all of this, the crowd keeps watching, because the crowd has been taught to, because bloodlines feel like destiny when you're told often enough, because it's easier to believe that power is inherited than to question why it's concentrated at all. You let that thought linger, heavy but distant, as the scene slowly reshapes itself again. The candles dim, the portraits blur. The knot of lineage tightens one more turn, and you drift onward, already sensing that the next figure stepping into this system will feel its weight even more acutely, especially when she's wearing a crown that was never meant to be comfortable. You don't leave the story so much as slide sideways into it, the way a shadow shifts when a torch moves. Now the focus narrows. The crowd is still there, the banners still flutter, but your attention is drawn to one figure crossing a threshold she didn't choose, a royal bride. She's young more often than not, arriving from somewhere else, carrying trunks of dresses, letters she'll reread until the paper softens, and an entire kingdom's expectation stitched invisibly into her sleeves. You start to notice how language changes around her. She is given, she is received, she is sent. These aren't romantic verbs, they're transactional. Brides in royal marriages functioned as political property, mobile symbols designed to fuse territories, soothe rivalries, or stake claims without firing a single arrow. Her body marks the border, her children will redraw the map. There's a mainstream historical fact that's impossible to ignore once you see it. Many royal brides were married into foreign courts specifically to neutralize threats. A daughter sent to a rival kingdom wasn't just a gesture of goodwill, she was collateral. If war broke out, harming her would mean harming one's own bloodline by proxy. Marriage became a human shield polite enough to pass as diplomacy. You imagine what it felt like to arrive somewhere unfamiliar, knowing your accent would always mark you as other. Foreign queens were watched closely, their loyalties questioned even when they behaved perfectly. Every letter home could be read as treason. Every favor requested for her birth family could be framed as manipulation. She was expected to assimilate instantly while remaining symbolically useful to both sides, a neat trick no one ever quite mastered. There's a quietly unsettling tidbit historians like to bring up in footnotes. Some royal brides were deliberately isolated upon arrival, familiar attendants dismissed, language barriers left intact, not always out of cruelty, sometimes out of prudence. A queen with no strong support network was easier to guide, or, less politely, easier to control. Independence was treated like a design flaw. Historians still argue whether these practices were conscious strategies or simply normalized habits reinforced over generations. Either way, the effect was chillingly consistent. A bride's personal identity dissolved into her function. She became the French queen, the Spanish consort, the Austrian bride, even decades after her arrival. Her origin mattered more than her voice. You notice how ceremony reinforces this erasure. The wedding ritual emphasizes transfer. A father's hand releases hers, another man's hand takes it. Blessings are spoken over her, not with her. Silence is expected, admired, praised. Stillness becomes virtue. The more composed she looks, the more successful the alliance appears. No pressure. And the jokes, yes, there are jokes, are usually about her accent, her customs, her food. Court humor punches down with impeccable manners. She smiles because she must. A queen who bristled too openly risked being labeled difficult, cold, or worse, politically dangerous. Control rarely announces itself as oppression. It prefers to dress as etiquette. You start to sense how narrow her allowed emotional range really is. Grateful, serene, maternal, these are acceptable. Homesick, suspicious, angry, unthinkable. Love, ironically, is optional, unless it interferes with duty. Her inner life is irrelevant as long as the outer performance holds. It's emotional minimalism enforced by protocol. One fringe but fascinating scholarly idea suggests that royal brides functioned as living treaties precisely because they were human. Unlike paper agreements, people can be displayed, paraded, dressed, and reproduced. Their suffering is quieter. Their compliance looks voluntary if staged carefully enough. A document can't smile for the crowd. A queen can. And the crowd matters. Always. Subjects were encouraged to see the bride as a gift bestowed upon them as much as upon the king. Pageants welcomed her. Bells rang. Speeches praised her beauty and virtue, qualities that conveniently implied passivity. The message was subtle but firm. She exists for stability, not disruption. You can't help noticing how quickly blame finds her if anything goes wrong. If the marriage falters, she's frigid. If alliance is sour, she's scheming. If heirs don't arrive, she's barren. The system that stripped her of agency suddenly demands accountability. Control is efficient like that. Responsibility flows downward. There's a moment repeated across history when a royal bride realizes she cannot go home. Even if she technically could, politically she cannot. Returning would signal failure. Staying means endurance. So she adapts, learns the customs, picks battles carefully, exercises influence sideways through favors, patronage, whispered counsel. Power for her is never direct. It's always borrowed, always conditional. You think back to the earlier halls, the earlier vows, and see how inevitable this was. Once marriage became a tool, the people within it became components. Some components were praised, others were quietly worn down. Brides bore the weight because they were designed to. And yet, and this matters, they weren't powerless. Many learned to navigate the system with astonishing skill. They sponsored artists, guided religious reforms, protected allies, raised heirs who reshaped continents. Control was real, but resistance often took the form of patience rather than rebellion. Survival itself became a strategy. Still, the cost lingers in the air. You feel it in the way her footsteps echo differently now, heavier, more careful. The crown she wears doesn't quite fit, but removing it was never an option. She moves forward because stopping isn't permitted. As the scene softens and shifts again, you carry this understanding with you. Royal weddings didn't just bind kingdoms, they repositioned people, turning individuals into instruments. And no one felt that transformation more sharply than the bride, standing at the center of a spectacle that claimed to celebrate her while quietly erasing her. The torchlight flickers, the crowd fades, and the fabric of the story tightens, drawing your attention to the next layer of control, one woven not into contracts or borders, but into clothing, gestures, and the practiced art of disappearing while being endlessly seen. You don't notice the veil at first, it's just there, floating softly in front of her face, catching the candlelight, diffusing every expression into something palatable and calm. But once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. The fabric isn't just decorative, it's instructional. It teaches you how to look at her and how much of her you're allowed to see. You begin to realize that royal weddings didn't rely only on contracts and bloodlines. They relied on choreography of the body, clothing, posture, ritual gestures. These were all tools of control, quietly training queens to occupy less space while appearing elevated. The irony is almost elegant. The higher her rank, the less visible her personhood. There's a mainstream historical fact hiding in plain sight here. In many European courts, queens and consorts were expected to master elaborate codes of dress and behavior that strictly limited spontaneous movement or speech in public settings. Court etiquette manuals spelled this out in exhausting detail. How to walk, when to bow, when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Silence wasn't just polite, it was power-aligned. The veil becomes your focal point because it perfectly captures this logic. Historically, veils symbolized modesty, purity, and transition. But in royal contexts, they also symbolized containment. A veiled bride was visually softened, her individuality blurred into an acceptable archetype. She wasn't meant to project thoughts, doubts, or opinions. She was meant to project calm continuity. Think less main character, more carefully managed brand asset. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to surprise people. In some royal courts, brides were instructed not to make direct eye contact with large portions of the audience during the ceremony. Looking down wasn't shyness, it was protocol. Eye contact implies agency, a lowered gaze implies submission. And once you encode that into ritual, it starts to feel natural, inevitable, even beautiful. Historians still argue whether these customs were consciously designed to suppress female authority, or whether they evolved from broader religious and cultural norms around gender and hierarchy. But, intent aside, the outcome was consistent. Queens learned early that visibility came with conditions. You could be seen, but only in approved ways. You could be admired, but not heard. And it wasn't just veils. Sleeves were weighted, trains were lengthened, corsetry restricted breath, jewelry added literal weight to the body. These weren't accidents of fashion. They slowed movement, encouraged stillness, enforced composure. A queen who moved slowly looked dignified. A queen who moved freely risked looking improper. Control doesn't always say no. Sometimes it just makes yes very, very uncomfortable. You picture her standing through hours of ceremony, muscles aching, expression neutral. And you realize that this physical discipline mirrored emotional discipline. A body trained not to fidget is a body trained not to react. Over time, restraint becomes habit, habit becomes identity, and identity becomes expectation. There's a faintly unsettling fringe theory that suggests royal fashion functioned as a kind of wearable behavioral training. dressed the body into compliance long enough and the mind follows. Whether or not that was intentional, the overlap is hard to ignore. Clothing shaped posture, posture shaped presence, presence shaped perception. The crowd didn't just see a queen, they saw a performance of obedience wrapped in splendor, and the crowd learned from it. Subjects absorbed these cues subconsciously. Queens were praised for being quiet, graceful, patient. Loudness was vulgar. Assertiveness was unbecoming. Authority was acceptable only when softened by deference. This wasn't just about one woman at one wedding. It was a lesson broadcast to everyone watching about who should lead and how. You think back to that earlier silence at the altar. Now it makes more sense. Words were dangerous. Words could be quoted, twisted, remembered. Silence left no evidence. A quiet queen couldn't be accused of saying the wrong thing. She could only be accused of existing incorrectly, which was a much more flexible charge. And when queens did speak, because some inevitably did, the backlash was swift. She was overstepping, meddling, forgetting her place. The same rituals that elevated her could be weaponized to discipline her. Control always keeps a receipt. Yet just as before, resistance didn't vanish. It adapted. Some queens learned to communicate through gesture, patronage, symbolism, a dress color chosen carefully, a public appearance timed precisely. Silence itself could become strategic. If you can't speak freely, you let others talk and reveal themselves instead. Power learned to whisper. As the veil is lifted at the end of the ceremony, it feels symbolic, but incomplete. Her face is revealed, but the rules remain. You realize that the unveiling isn't liberation, it's confirmation. She has crossed the threshold. The expectations are now permanent. You let that image settle, a crown, a veil folded away, and a woman trained to disappear while standing at the very center of the room. This is how control becomes elegant. This is how submission learns to smile. And as the fabric fades from view, the story moves with you, carrying forward the understanding that the most effective constraints are the ones that look like tradition, soft, familiar, unquestioned, until you finally notice how tightly they're tied. You step back into the crowd now because that's where the next layer of control lives, not at the altar, not in the contracts, but in the eyes watching from every angle, the murmurs swelling and settling like a tide. Royal weddings didn't just bind two people, they bound the public emotionally, wrapping private arrangements in collective participation until everyone felt invested. You feel it immediately. The press of bodies, the shared anticipation, the strange intimacy of standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers to witness something that technically has nothing to do with you, yet somehow feels essential. This was not accidental. Public royal weddings were engineered to make subjects feel included while keeping real power firmly out of reach. A classic look, don't touch arrangement. There's a mainstream historical fact that supports this. By the late medieval and early modern periods, royal weddings were increasingly staged as mass events, complete with processions, public feasts, and open-access rituals. Even people who couldn't see the ceremony directly could hear the bells, taste the bread, or watch the fireworks. Participation didn't require proximity, just emotional buy-in. You start to notice how cleverly this worked. When people celebrated a royal wedding, they weren't just celebrating love. They were celebrating continuity. The future felt planned, secure. Someone else was managing the big picture, and all you had to do was cheer. It's comforting, honestly. Control works best when it feels like relief. Here's a slightly absurd but telling tidbit. In some cities, bakers were required to produce special wedding loaves stamped with royal symbols and distribute them freely. Free bread during a wedding wasn't generosity, it was messaging. Associate the crown with abundance, joy, and full stomachs. It's hard to feel revolutionary when you're chewing on free carbs. Historians still argue whether the emotional attachment fostered by these spectacles was deliberate manipulation or simply a byproduct of shared ritual. But again, intent matters less than outcome. Public weddings train populations to equate royal stability with personal well-being. If the king marries well, the harvest will be good. If the queen smiles, the future is safe. Logic not required. You realize something unsettling. The public wasn't just watching the wedding. The wedding was watching the public. Crowds were monitored, reactions noted, loyalty measured in cheers and compliance. Absence could be suspicious. Enthusiasm was remembered. Celebration became a soft loyalty test, passed without anyone noticing the exam. And for the couple at the center, especially the bride, this meant living under a permanent gaze. Her body became public property in a new way. Her fertility, demeanor, and appearance were no longer personal. They were topics of collective speculation. The crowd that once cheered could just as easily turn cold. Control giveth applause, control taketh away approval. There's a fringe theory floating around cultural studies that compares royal weddings to early mass media events. No printing press needed, just bodies, sound, and repetition. The same images, the same phrases, the same emotional beats replayed across towns and taverns. Everyone saw a version of the same story, even if the details varied. Shared narrative is powerful glue. You catch yourself recognizing the pattern because it hasn't really changed. Modern screens replace medieval streets, but the mechanics are familiar. Big wedding, big crowd, big feelings. The sense that you're witnessing history while quietly absorbing a lesson about hierarchy and belonging. Sleepy déjà vu, right? The crowd's role also served another purpose, accountability theatre. When a marriage failed, the public already felt invested enough to feel betrayed. Blame could be redirected, discontent could be moralized. It wasn't just bad politics, it was a broken promise. Weddings created expectations that could later be exploited to justify control. You imagine standing there as bells ring, feeling oddly proud of a union that has nothing to do with your own life. That's the magic trick. Control becomes emotional infrastructure, invisible until you lean on it. And because the crowd is watching, behavior tightens, deviations stand out. Queens learn quickly that every gesture will be interpreted, repeated, exaggerated. Smile too little, you're cold. Smile too much, you're frivolous. You can't win, but you can endure. Endurance becomes the unofficial job description. As the celebration winds down, you notice how exhaustion settles in. Not just physical, but emotional. Constant spectacle is draining, but it leaves behind a residue, habituation. After enough pageantry, hierarchy feels normal, inevitable, comfortable even. And comfort is a powerful sedative. You drift away from the crowd as torches burn low, carrying with you the quiet realization that control doesn't always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as invitation. Come celebrate with us. Come feel included. Just don't ask for anything beyond applause. And as the echo of bells fades, another structure comes into focus, one even older, heavier, and more enduring than crowns. Because once the public is emotionally bound, the next step is moral binding. And for that, control reaches upward toward the divine. You don't notice the shift at first because it feels like gravity rather than movement. The bells fade, the crowd thins, and suddenly the ceiling seems higher. Stone arches stretch upward, candles multiply, and the air grows heavier with incense and expectation. You've stepped into sacred space now where control stops pretending to be political and starts calling itself holy. Religion doesn't just attend the royal wedding, it officiates it, blesses it, explains it, and locks it into place with language that's very hard to argue with, because you can challenge a king, at least in theory. Challenging God is a tougher customer service call. There's a mainstream historical fact that anchors this moment firmly in reality. From late antiquity onward, Christian churches in Europe asserted increasing authority over marriage, eventually defining it as a sacrament. Once marriage became sacred, breaking or questioning it wasn't just illegal or impolite, it was sinful. Royal unions, already politically binding, now carried divine weight. Control got back up. You can almost feel the relief this gave rulers. A marriage sanctified by the church wasn't merely a strategy, it was God's will. Alliances could be framed as obedience, endurance could be praised as virtue, suffering could be rebranded as spiritual refinement. If you ever needed a cosmic cosigner, this was it. For queens especially, the message was clear and quietly brutal. Obedience to husband mirrored obedience to God. Patience became piety. Silence became holiness. If marriage was a sacred duty, then personal unhappiness wasn't a flaw in the system, it was a test of faith. And tests, as you know, are meant to be passed, not questioned. There's a strangely specific tidbit that pops up in medieval sermons delivered around royal weddings. Brides were often compared to the church itself, pure, receptive, enduring. It sounds poetic until you realize what it implies. The church does not argue back. The church submits to divine order. It exists to serve a higher structure. Not exactly a flattering metaphor if you enjoy autonomy. Historians still argue whether religious authorities were active collaborators in political control or whether they genuinely believed they were protecting social stability through sacred marriage. As always, the truth probably lives in the uncomfortable overlap. Belief and power are not mutually exclusive. They feed each other beautifully. You start to see how this spiritual framing smoothed over contradictions. A queen could be isolated, surveilled, and restricted, but still praised publicly as blessed. A loveless union could be held up as ideal because it looked orderly. God, conveniently, never filed complaints. And the rituals reinforced this constantly. Kneeling. Vows spoken in prescribed language. Blessings delivered downward from male clergy. The physical choreography mirrored the hierarchy being taught. Even posture became theology. Stand here, bow there, accept what is given. It's hard to rebel when rebellion feels like sacrilege. You might expect religion to soften control, but here it sharpens it, because political power can change hands. Dynasties fall. Churches, especially in this period, are patient. They outlast rulers. When they attach moral meaning to marriage, they embed control across generations. Long game, very effective. Here's a light joke before we sink too deep. If medieval sermons had comment sections, they would have been an absolute nightmare. Actually, Father, have you considered that maybe... No, you have not. Sit down. Pray harder. Religion also offered something else, justification for surveillance. Confession blurred into monitoring. Moral guidance slid into behavioral enforcement. A queen's private life was never fully private when her virtue was considered a matter of public salvation. Spiritual concern is a very polite excuse to ask invasive questions. You notice how blame shifts once religion enters the frame. If a marriage struggles, it's not because the arrangement was cruel or impractical. It's because someone, usually the woman, failed spiritually, didn't pray enough, didn't submit enough, didn't endure beautifully enough. Control loves a narrative that redirects responsibility downward. There's also a subtler effect. By framing marriage as sacred, religion discouraged alternatives. Divorce became nearly impossible. Annulments required extraordinary justification and political leverage. Once you were in, you were in. Permanence wasn't romantic, it was administrative. The system needed stability more than happiness. And yet, and this matters, religion wasn't monolithic. Different clerics interpreted doctrine differently. Some queens found allies among spiritual advisors who offered quiet support or loopholes. Convents sometimes became refuges. Piety could be weaponized in multiple directions. Control systems are rarely as tidy in practice as they are on paper. Still, the dominant message held: marriage equals duty, duty equals virtue, virtue equals obedience. The logic loop closed neatly, leaving very little room to breathe. If you were unhappy, the solution wasn't change, it was prayer, which, to be fair, is cheaper than systemic reform. You imagine a royal bride kneeling at the altar, hearing words about sacrifice and holiness, and realizing that her personal life has just been absorbed into a cosmic narrative. It's not just her husband she must satisfy now, it's heaven, no pressure. And the crowd absorbs this too. Subjects learn that hierarchy isn't just political, it's moral. Questioning royal marriages starts to feel like questioning divine order. That's a powerful deterrent. Control doesn't need guards when guilt does the job for free. As the ceremony ends, the sacred space releases you slowly. Incense thins, candles dim, but the moral framing lingers, heavy and persistent. You carry it with you as the story shifts again, because once marriage is sanctified, its consequences ripple outward into borders, diplomacy, and the quiet reshaping of entire populations. You feel the narrative pulling you toward movement now, across seas, across languages, across unfamiliar courts, because when religion blesses the contract, sending brides far from home becomes not just strategic, but righteous. And righteousness, as history keeps proving, travels very well. You feel the ground shift under your feet, not violently, just steadily, like a ship easing away from the harbor. Salt creeps into the air, languages blur, familiar landmarks dissolve behind you. This is what it feels like to follow a royal bride across borders, carrying peace like a fragile package that everyone pretends won't break. Foreign brides were imported solutions. That's the blunt truth beneath the velvet. When rival powers threatened war, when noble factions grew restless, when treaties felt flimsy, rulers reached for marriage as a calming mechanism. Send a daughter, receive a queen. The logic was simple. Shared blood discourages open conflict. You hesitate to attack someone who now technically belongs to your family. Technically. There's a mainstream historical fact that reinforces this pattern again and again. Many high-profile royal marriages were explicitly negotiated to neutralize hostile neighbors or rival claims. Think of Habsburg brides scattered across Europe like living chess pieces, each marriage designed to settle a region without deploying troops. Let others wage war, the saying went. You marry. You imagine the moment of departure, the last familiar sunrise, the long procession away from home. She's dressed magnificently, of course, because symbolism never takes a day off. But underneath the layers is a very practical message. You are leaving to become someone else. Your accent will soften or be mocked. Your customs will be scrutinized. Your loyalty will always be provisional. Here's a quietly chilling tidbit. Some royal brides were required to undergo symbolic rebirth rituals upon arrival. New clothes, new names, new religious practices if necessary. This wasn't just adaptation, it was erasure with ceremony. A foreign queen was expected to embody harmony, not hybridity. Blending too visibly meant divided loyalty. Control prefers clean lines. Historians still argue whether these marriages genuinely reduced conflict in the long term or merely postponed it. In some cases, they worked temporarily. In others, they created new resentments, especially when the bride was blamed for diplomatic failures she never controlled. Peace, it turns out, is a heavy burden to place on one person's shoulders. You notice how isolation intensifies here. A foreign queen lacks deep roots, that's the point. Without strong local alliances, she depends entirely on the crown she married into. Gratitude replaces leverage, compliance replaces negotiation. It's dependency disguised as honor. And yet the expectation placed on her is enormous. She is meant to soothe tension simply by existing. Her presence is supposed to reassure nobles, calm borders, and symbolize unity. No one asks how she feels about being the emotional shock absorber of two suspicious courts. Emotional labor, but make it geopolitical. There's a faintly ironic joke embedded in all this. If peace fails, everyone acts surprised. As if centuries of hostility can be undone by one wedding cake and a few well-chosen hymns. But the performance must go on. Public optimism is mandatory. Doubt is treason adjacent. You start to see how foreign queens lived under constant suspicion. If unrest flares, is she secretly encouraging it? If negotiations stall, is she influencing her husband? If she writes home, what exactly is she saying? Surveillance tightens politely. Privacy evaporates quietly. Control smiles while it listens. At the same time, subjects are encouraged to project hopes onto her. She becomes a symbol of reconciliation whether she asked for the role or not. When peace holds, she's praised. When it cracks, she's expendable. Symbols are useful that way. There's also a subtler effect you can't ignore. By importing queens, rulers avoided empowering local noble families through marriage. No domestic rivals gained influence. The foreign bride arrives alone, politically speaking. It's a clever move. Cold, but clever. And yet, and here's where the system shows its cracks, some foreign queens learned to navigate this isolation brilliantly. They became intermediaries, cultural translators, quiet power brokers. They leveraged their outsider status to see patterns locals missed. Control created constraints, but it also created unexpected vantage points. Still, the cost was real. Homesickness wasn't just emotional, it was strategic vulnerability. A queen who longed too openly for home risked being labeled disloyal. So, longing learned to whisper. Memory became private. Identity fractured gently over years. As the ship metaphor fades and solid ground returns beneath you, you carry this understanding forward. Importing brides wasn't about unity. It was about containment. Keep rivals close. Keep queens dependent. Keep peace just believable enough to postpone chaos. And the story keeps tightening because once a queen's presence is meant to stabilize the realm, her body itself becomes a site of state interest. Borders are secured, alliances signed. Now the future must be manufactured, and for that control turns its attention to heirs. You feel the pressure before anyone says it out loud. It settles into the room like a held breath, polite but relentless. The wedding is over, the celebrations faded into memory, and now the real countdown begins. Because in royal logic, a marriage that doesn't produce heirs is just an expensive pause button. You start to notice how quickly the focus shifts. The bride becomes a wife, and almost immediately, a potential mother. Her body, once draped in symbolism, is now monitored with interest that pretends to be concern. Every illness, every missed cycle, every rumor becomes a data point. This isn't curiosity, it's statecraft with a very narrow definition of success. There's a mainstream historical fact that underpins this entire phase. In hereditary monarchies, the production of legitimate heirs was essential to prevent succession crises, civil wars, and foreign intervention. A single child, or the lack of one, could determine whether a kingdom fractured or survived. Fertility wasn't personal, it was political infrastructure. You can feel how the atmosphere tightens. Time is suddenly measured differently. Months matter, years matter more. A queen who hasn't conceived quickly enough attracts whispers. Advisors suggest remedies, clergy recommend prayers. Physicians hover with theories that range from misguided to downright bizarre. Everyone has an opinion, and none of them require consent. Here's a quirky but unsettling tidbit. Some courts kept detailed records of queens' menstrual cycles, diets, and daily routines, all in the name of maximizing the chances of conception. This wasn't secrecy, it was administration. Reproduction became a managed process, overseen by people who would never bear the consequences themselves. Romance didn't just leave the room, it was escorted out politely and locked outside. Historians still argue whether this level of scrutiny was driven more by genuine fear of instability or by entrenched gender assumptions that placed reproductive responsibility almost entirely on women. The result, however, was unmistakable. Kings who failed to produce heirs were unfortunate. Queens who failed were culpable. You notice how blame flows predictably. If no child appears, her body is defective. If children are born but die young, her body is weak. If daughters arrive instead of sons, her body has failed again, as if chromosomes took marching orders from court protocol. Control is allergic to randomness, so it invents fault. And when heirs do arrive, the pressure doesn't ease, it multiplies. Now there is monitoring of the child, of the mother's influence, of her health, mood, and behavior. A queen raising the future ruler is suddenly both essential and threatening. Too involved and she's overreaching, too distant and she's negligent. You can almost admire the system's ability to criticize from all angles at once. There's a darker fringe idea that some historians cautiously explore, that the intense focus on heirs turned royal nurseries into political battlegrounds, caregivers chosen for loyalty, access tightly controlled, information filtered, even infancy wasn't neutral. From the moment a child drew breath, control began shaping the narrative around them. You think back to the wedding hall, to the bells and smiles, and realize how misleading that image was. The ceremony promised a future. This phase demands proof. Heirs are insurance policies, and queens are expected to underwrite them with their bodies. And yet queens were not passive in this process. Many understood the leverage heirs provided. A mother of the future king could gain influence, protection, even authority. Control cuts both ways, but only if you survive long enough to use it. That's a pretty big if. You sense how anxiety becomes ambient. Pregnancy is dangerous, childbirth is risky, infant mortality is common. The stakes are absurdly high for outcomes no one fully controls. And still the system insists on accountability. It's like blaming the weather for not following a schedule. A light joke slips in here because it has to. Imagine being held responsible for the biological equivalent of a dice roll, except the dice are cursed, everyone's watching, and the fate of a kingdom is riding on the outcome. Relax, no pressure at all. As time stretches on, you realize heirs aren't just about continuity, they're about control of the future. A child secures alliances, deters rivals, calms nobles. The mere existence of an heir stabilizes power even before they can speak. It's impressive, it's terrifying, it's very efficient. And when heirs don't come or don't survive, the consequences are swift. Annulments are discussed, mistresses appear, marriages are quietly reclassified as failures. The sanctity preached earlier suddenly develops footnotes. God's will, it seems, is flexible when politics demand it. You let this settle gently because it's heavy. Royal weddings promised stability, but stability demanded reproduction. Reproduction demanded sacrifice. And sacrifice, as always, was framed as honor. As the nursery fades from view, the story nudges you onward again, because once reproduction is politicized, law steps in to formalize it. What began as expectation becomes regulation. And control, never content with suggestion alone, starts writing things down. You sense the shift before you see it. The soft furnishings of nurseries and private chambers harden into parchment, seals, and signatures. This is where expectation stops being implied and starts being enforced. The language grows colder, more precise, less forgiving. You've arrived at the point where marriage becomes law, and law becomes a quiet form of violence. Royal wedding law rarely announced itself as cruelty. It dressed as order, protection, stability. But as you look closer, you realize how carefully it fenced people in, especially women, while presenting those fences as safeguards. Once the vows were spoken and blessed, legal structures snapped into place like locks you didn't hear closing. There's a mainstream historical fact that defines this entire section. In many monarchies, marriage law severely limited queens' and consorts' rights to property, movement, divorce, and custody. Legal identity often merged with or vanished into that of the husband. The crown might be shared symbolically, but authority was not. You notice how contracts that once negotiated alliances now governed lives. Dowries came with conditions. Inheritance laws dictated where a queen could live if widowed. Custody of children defaulted to the father's line. Even personal correspondence could be regulated. The system didn't need constant enforcement. Its existence was enough to shape behavior. Here's a quietly horrifying tidbit that tends to get glossed over. Some marriage laws explicitly prevented queens from leaving the realm without permission, even in cases of illness or family emergency. Escape wasn't illegal, it was unthinkable. Control works best when alternatives never fully form in the imagination. Historians still argue whether these laws reflected genuine concern for political stability or whether they primarily served to reinforce male dominance under the guise of governance. As usual, both can be true at the same time. Systems rarely admit their own biases. They prefer to call them tradition. You feel the asymmetry sharply now. A king could take lovers, negotiate treaties, travel freely. A queen doing the same would be scandal incarnate. Law didn't just punish behavior, it defined what behavior was imaginable. That's a subtler, more durable kind of control. And yet these laws weren't always rigid in practice. Exceptions existed, negotiations happened. Influence could bend rules, but the baseline mattered. The default assumption was restraint, permission, oversight. Freedom was conditional, and conditions could be revoked quietly. There's a fringe, scholarly idea that describes this legal framework as soft violence. No blood, no chains, just rules that slowly constrict options until endurance feels like choice. The violence isn't in the act, it's in the inevitability. You start to see how law interacted with religion and spectacle. A queen who endured hardship without complaint was praised as virtuous. A queen who resisted legal constraints was framed as disruptive. Control trained not just behavior, but interpretation. And the public absorbed this too. Subjects learned to see marital endurance as noble, legal restrictions as necessary. If a queen suffered, it was tragic but meaningful. Suffering, when aestheticized, becomes politically useful. You think back to earlier sections, the veils, the silence, the airs, and realize law was always waiting in the wings. Ritual prepares, religion sanctifies, law enforces. It's a tidy sequence, almost elegant in its efficiency. A light joke flickers here because you need one. Imagine signing a contract where the fine print includes you may not leave the country, make decisions, or retain custody of your own children. But don't worry, it's for stability. As time passes, you notice how these laws outlast individuals. Queens die, kings change, statutes remain. Control becomes institutional memory. Even reformers struggle to dismantle rules everyone assumes are natural, and when crises hit, scandals, infertility, political shifts, law provides the mechanism for swift action. Annulments, exile, confinement, all legal, all proper, all devastating. You let this realization settle gently because it's heavy. Royal weddings weren't just cultural events, they were legal gateways. Step through and your life was no longer entirely your own. As the parchment rolls itself back up and seals cool, you feel the narrative pulling forward again. Because once law defines marriage, it can be deployed strategically, lavishly, publicly, especially when rulers feel threatened. Control, after all, loves a good distraction. And nothing distracts quite like a wedding when everything else is falling apart. You feel the tension before anyone admits it exists. The streets are decorated, the bells polished, the banners unfurled, but underneath the colour, something is wrong. Grain stores are low, borders feel brittle, rumours move faster than official statements, and right on schedule, a royal wedding is announced, bright and reassuring as a staged sunrise. This is not coincidence, this is timing. There's a mainstream historical fact that becomes impossible to ignore once you start looking for it. Some of the most extravagant royal weddings occurred during periods of economic strain, political unrest, or looming conflict. Lavish ceremony wasn't a sign of abundance, it was a counterspell. When authority wobbled, spectacle stepped in to steady it. You stand among the crowd again, but this time the energy feels sharper, hungrier. People cheer loudly, perhaps too loudly, as if volume alone can drown out anxiety. Weddings during crises served as emotional redirection. Don't look at the empty granaries, look at the crown jewels. Don't count the dead, count the blessings. Control doesn't erase hardship, it reframes it. Here's a strangely telling tidbit. In several early modern cities, civic leaders were instructed to organize extra pageantry around royal weddings, specifically to raise morale. Music, fireworks, free drink. A temporary holiday from reality. The logic was simple and very human. If people feel hopeful, they are less likely to revolt, or at least less likely to revolt this week. Historians still argue whether rulers genuinely believed these spectacles helped stabilize society, or whether they cynically exploited public emotion to buy time. The uncomfortable truth is that both interpretations can coexist. You can believe in your own performance while still benefiting from it. You notice how the narrative around these weddings changes subtly. They are framed as symbols of renewal, fresh starts, new chapters. Language gets warmer even as circumstances grow colder. A young bride becomes the embodiment of future prosperity, no matter how fragile that promise actually is. Her smile is asked to carry weight it was never meant to bear. And when unrest persists despite the celebration, blame doesn't travel upward, it drifts sideways, toward advisors, toward outsiders, toward the Queen herself if she happens to be foreign, quiet, or insufficiently adored. Control rarely takes responsibility for failing narratives, it simply writes new ones. There's a faintly dark joke hiding here. It's hard to organize a rebellion when you're busy attending parades and eating commemorative pastries, bread and circuses, but make it matrimonial. You start to see how repetition matters. One wedding during crisis might feel suspicious. Several over generations start to feel traditional. Pattern becomes expectation. People learn that when times are bad, a royal marriage will appear like a ritual offering, not a solution, but a distraction with good lighting. For the couple at the center, especially the bride, this timing adds another layer of pressure. She isn't just a wife or a future mother now. She's a symbol of reassurance. Her body language, her fertility, her public demeanor are read as economic indicators. If she's happy, things must be fine. If she's not, well, that's awkward. There's also the uncomfortable truth that lavish weddings during hardship sent a message to elites as much as to commoners. Look how strong we are. Look how unbothered. We can still afford gold-threaded cloaks and weeks-long feasts. Power in these moments performs indifference to suffering as a form of dominance. And the church, the law, the crowd, all the structures you've already noticed, fall neatly into place to support this illusion. Sanctified vows promise stability. Legal contracts promise continuity. Public celebration promises unity. Each layer reinforces the others, forming a comforting shell around a very fragile core. You imagine standing there, clapping dutifully, feeling both swept up and slightly uneasy. You might not have the words for it, but your instincts sense the mismatch. Something expensive is being shown to distract from something essential that's missing. As the festivities wind down, the anxiety doesn't disappear. It just sinks back beneath the surface, quieter now, harder to grab. The wedding has done its job. It didn't fix the problem. It postponed the reckoning. And that's often all control needs: time. You let the music fade and the banners come down, knowing the pattern will repeat. Because once rulers learn that weddings can soften crises, they reuse the tactic. They refine it. They export it. Which is exactly what happens next as the story stretches outward beyond Europe, beyond familiar borders, carrying crowns, contracts, and carefully staged unions into entirely new worlds. You feel the horizon widen now, the way it does when a familiar map suddenly fails you. The architecture changes. Fabrics feel lighter or heavier. Languages stack on top of each other like imperfect translations. Royal weddings don't stay home. Once perfected, they travel, packed alongside flags, laws, and assumptions about who should rule whom. This is where marriage becomes imperial. There's a mainstream historical fact that anchors this expansion. European empires routinely used royal and quasi-royal marriages to legitimize colonial authority, blending local elites into imperial systems through carefully staged unions. Sometimes these marriages were fully dynastic. Sometimes they were symbolic, informal, or strategically ambiguous. All of them served the same purpose: to make domination look consensual. You notice how the language softens again. These unions are described as bridges between cultures, gestures of unity, signs of mutual respect. But look closer, and the imbalance is unmistakable. One side brings crowns, armies, and paperwork. The other brings legitimacy, land access, or compliance. Marriage becomes a stamp of approval, pressed onto territories that never asked for it. Here's a lesser-known but telling tidbit. In several colonial contexts, European powers actively discouraged their monarchs from marrying locally while encouraging lower-ranking officials to do so. Why? Because a true royal marriage implied equality. Control required intimacy without parity, connection without concession. The hierarchy had to remain visible, even in bed. Historians still argue whether these strategies were primarily pragmatic or deeply ideological, whether empire builders genuinely believed marriage could civilize conquered peoples, or whether the rhetoric simply masked economic extraction. Either way, the weddings did their work. They normalized presence, they softened resistance, they made power feel familiar. You start to see how royal marriage narratives were exported alongside religion and law. European wedding customs were imposed as markers of legitimacy. Local practices were dismissed as backward or unofficial unless they aligned with imperial norms. Marriage became a cultural filter. Only certain unions counted, only certain bloodlines mattered, and the women caught in these systems bore layered expectations. Indigenous brides were expected to symbolize harmony while disappearing culturally. European brides sent abroad were expected to represent moral superiority while remaining distant. Different roles, same result. Identity reshaped to serve authority. There's a quietly uncomfortable pattern you can't ignore. These marriages often coincided with moments when colonial control was unstable, resistance brewing, trade threatened, borders contested. Once again, a wedding appears, not to solve the problem, but to soften it. Control, you're learning, is very consistent. You imagine the ceremony itself, a blend of rituals carefully curated, enough local flavor to appear respectful, enough imperial structure to dominate the narrative. The crowd watches, unsure whether this is celebration or surrender. The ambiguity is intentional. Ambiguity buys time. A light joke drifts through your thoughts because otherwise this gets heavy fast. Nothing says mutual partnership, quite like arriving with gunboats and a marriage proposal in the same suitcase. And yet some individuals within these unions carved out unexpected spaces of agency. Cultural exchange happened despite intentions. Children grew up bilingual. Customs blended in ways no treaty predicted. Control systems hate this part. They're the messy humanity that refuses to stay scripted. Still, the overarching structure held. Marriage provided a veneer of legitimacy that raw force alone could not sustain. It suggested consent where there was none. It reframed domination as family. And family, as you know, is very hard to argue with without being labeled ungrateful. You feel the weight of repetition now. Europe did not invent this tactic, but it refined it and scaled it aggressively. Wedding bells became global instruments, ringing far from their original halls, carrying assumptions about hierarchy, obedience, and destiny. As the imperial stage dims, you realize the pattern is nearing its modern edge. Because once these narratives spread widely enough, they don't need crowns to survive. They embed themselves in stories, in fairy tales, in the way romance itself is taught. And that's where the control gets clever, because once people internalize the myth, the wedding doesn't need an empire behind it. It governs expectations all on its own. You don't notice the shift at first because it feels gentler, softer, less armored. The canons and treaties fade, replaced by stories, paintings, songs, later books, eventually screens. Control loosens its grip just enough to slip inside the imagination. This is where royal weddings stop being political events you watch and start becoming emotional templates you absorb. There's a mainstream historical fact that frames this transformation. By the 18th and 19th centuries, monarchies increasingly relied on romanticized public images to maintain relevance, especially as their direct political power faced challenges. Weddings were no longer just alliances, they were narratives, carefully edited ones. You see it in portraits that emphasize tenderness, in memoirs that soften coercion into destiny, in popular stories that frame endurance as love and silence as grace. The brutal edges of earlier centuries are filed down until what remains feels aspirational. Who wouldn't want a love that saves a kingdom? Here's a quietly strange tidbit. Some royal couples were actively coached to display affection in public, even if none existed privately. Hand-holding, shared glances, synchronized movements. These weren't spontaneous moments, they were rehearsed. Romance became performance art with political funding. Historians still argue whether this shift represented genuine cultural change or simply a new strategy of control adapted to a more literate, skeptical public. When people start questioning authority, you don't demand obedience, you inspire it. You realize how effective this was. Romance reframed sacrifice as choice. If a queen endured hardship, it wasn't because she had to, it was because she loved deeply. Love became the explanation that erased coercion. Control learned to hide behind emotion, and the lesson spread downward. Subjects absorbed these stories and applied them to their own lives. Endurance became noble. Silence became strength. If a queen could bear it all with a soft smile, why shouldn't you? Royal weddings didn't just model power, they modeled patience. There's an almost mischievous irony here. By turning royal marriages into fairy tales, monarchies encouraged people to idealize institutions that limited them. It's like advertising a cage by decorating it with flowers. A light joke drifts through because you need the oxygen. Imagine being told your emotional fulfillment should look like a portrait commissioned by the state. Smile more. Think less. True love conquers all, except contracts. You start to notice how these narratives conveniently omit certain details. Age gaps, power imbalances, lack of consent, all smoothed over by soft lighting and selective memory. History gets edited not with lies, but with omission. And once these stories solidify, they're hard to challenge. Criticizing a royal wedding starts to feel like criticizing love itself. You're not against power, you're just bitter, or cynical, or joyless. Control doesn't argue, it discredits. This romantic framing also helps modernize old constraints. Gender roles embedded in royal marriages are presented as timeless truths rather than historical constructions. Tradition becomes destiny, destiny becomes natural, natural becomes unquestionable. You sense how deeply this sinks in. Even people who dislike monarchy still know the scripts, the dress, the procession, the kiss, the idea that a wedding can reset public mood, that love can stabilize chaos. It's a powerful myth, and myths are resilient. And yet, cracks form. Every generation produces viewers who notice the performance, who ask why happiness looks so constrained, why fairy tales require so much silence. These questions don't overthrow systems, but they erode them slowly. As the stories grow more familiar, you feel the narrative turning again, because not every royal wedding fit the script. Some refused it outright, and those moments, rare, disruptive, revealed just how much control the ritual was meant to enforce. You drift toward those outliers now, knowing that rebellion in a system this polished doesn't look like shouting. It looks like choosing wrong. Loving inconveniently, marrying without permission. And history, as you're about to see, really didn't like that. You feel the mood change the moment someone steps out of line. It's subtle at first, like a missed note in a familiar song. The crowd still gathers, the bells still ring, but the smiles tighten and the whispers sharpen, because this wedding, this one, was not approved in the usual way. Rebellious royal marriages didn't just surprise courts, they frightened them. When a king or prince chose love over strategy, it wasn't seen as romantic defiance, it was seen as structural sabotage. Control depends on predictability, and nothing rattles a system faster than a ruler who refuses the script. There's a mainstream historical fact that anchors this fear. Throughout European history, monarchs who married without consent from advisors, parliament, or church often triggered political crises, succession disputes, or outright rebellion. Marriage was too important to be personal. Making it personal was an act of destabilization. You can feel the anxiety ripple outward. Nobles worry about lost alliances, clergy worry about precedent. Foreign courts reassess treaties, all because two people decided their private desires mattered more than collective strategy. In this context, love isn't sweet, it's radioactive. Here's a telling tidbit that borders on absurd. Some unauthorized royal marriages were retroactively declared invalid, not because of theological flaws, but because they were politically inconvenient. Suddenly, vows spoken before God weren't enough. Sanctity, it turns out, has an asterisk. Historians still argue whether these rebellious unions genuinely threatened political stability or whether elites exaggerated the danger to discourage imitation. The truth likely sits in the middle. One love match wouldn't topple a monarchy, but letting it stand uncontested might encourage others to ask uncomfortable questions. You notice how punishment unfolds. Sometimes it's swift and dramatic, exile, imprisonment, public shaming. Other times it's quieter, titles withheld, children declared illegitimate, the marriage acknowledged but never fully accepted. Control prefers precision over spectacle when it can manage it. And the crowd is conflicted. Romantic narratives make these stories tempting, star-crossed lovers defying tradition. But the same public trained to love royal stability is also trained to fear its disruption. Sympathy mixes with suspicion. Love becomes controversial. There's an ironic twist here. The very fairy tales that glorified royal romance made rebellious marriages more dangerous. If love is sacred, then choosing the wrong love feels like betrayal. Control sets the emotional rules, then punishes you for breaking them. A light joke sneaks in because otherwise this is bleak. Imagine being told you can rule a kingdom, command armies, and alter the course of history, but choosing your own spouse is where we draw the line. You start to see how these unions exposed the machinery behind the curtain. When control is challenged, it reveals itself. Laws are enforced Suddenly, traditions harden, moral arguments appear on demand, the system stops pretending to be gentle. And yet some of these marriages endured, not because the system softened, but because it adapted. Over time, a scandal could be rebranded, children could be legitimized later. History could be rewritten with enough distance and enough portraits painted in softer colors. These moments matter because they show what royal weddings were meant to prevent. Not unhappiness, uncertainty. A ruler who chooses freely reminds everyone else that hierarchy is constructed, not inevitable. That's the real danger. You let this realization linger as the scene fades, because rebellion didn't dismantle the system, but it forced it to evolve. And evolution is exactly what happens next, as monarchy steps into the modern age, shedding some weight while keeping its oldest strings intact. The crowns look lighter now, the rules sound kinder, but control, as you've learned, doesn't disappear. It just learns to smile better for the cameras. You almost miss the transition because it feels so familiar. The architecture sharpens into clean lines. The candlelight is replaced by camera flashes. Crowds still gather, but now they're organized behind barriers, phones lifted like modern torches. The monarchy hasn't vanished, it's been renovated. Modern royal weddings look freer, lighter, warmer, that's the promise anyway. Love matches are announced with relief. Brides speak, grooms cry, commentators repeat the word choice, like it's a spell. And yet, as you settle into the rhythm, you start noticing the old strings humming beneath the new music. There's a mainstream historical fact anchoring this era. Constitutional monarchies dramatically reduced the formal political power of royal families, but they retained enormous symbolic influence. Weddings became less about treaties and more about public legitimacy. Control shifted from governance to narrative. You feel it in the choreography. Every gesture is still managed, just reframed as authenticity. A spontaneous laugh approved, a tear captured perfectly. Even rebellion is curated, break a rule, but only one. Enough to seem human, not enough to seem threatening. Freedom, but within branding guidelines. Here's a quietly revealing tidbit. Modern royal couples often receive extensive media training before their weddings, including guidance on body language, tone, and relatable behavior. The goal isn't deception, it's consistency. Control loves predictability, even when it's dressed as personality. Historians still argue whether modern royal weddings represent genuine cultural progress or simply a softer continuation of older power dynamics. The constraints are looser, yes, but they haven't vanished. They've gone algorithmic. You notice how pressure hasn't disappeared. It's redistributed. Public scrutiny replaces court surveillance. Social media replaces pamphlets and whispers. The crowd is bigger now, louder, and far less forgiving. A modern royal bride may speak more freely, but every word is archived, dissected, and judged. Silence is still safer, it's just harder to achieve. And the old expectations linger. Fertility remains a fascination. Behavior is still policed. Modernity is praised as long as it doesn't disrupt tradition too much, push too far, and the same language reappears. Duty, responsibility, the institution. Control hasn't changed its vocabulary, it's just lowered its volume. There's a dry little joke hovering here. Congratulations, you're allowed to marry for love, as long as that love polls well internationally. You also notice how weddings now serve as global soft power. They export national identity, stability, and charm. Tourism spikes, merchandise sells. A well-executed ceremony reassures not just citizens, but markets. It's monarchy as lifestyle brand, with vows as the launch event. And yet cracks are visible. Some couples step away, refuse titles, choose privacy. These decisions are framed as personal, but the institutional response is always revealing. Supportive, yes, but conditional. There is still a line. Everyone knows where it is, even if it's never drawn out loud. You sense how familiar this all feels now. The forms have changed, but the function echoes. Weddings still teach the public how to feel about hierarchy. They still offer emotional stability in uncertain times. They still redirect attention gently upward. As the cameras dim and the last headlines fade, you're left with a strange mix of progress and repetition. Less overt control, more subtle pressure, fewer chains, more expectations. And that's what carries you into the final stretch of this journey, because when control survives long enough, it stops feeling imposed. It starts feeling inherited, familiar, traditional, which is exactly where it hides best. You arrive here gently, almost without noticing, the way you realize you've been awake far longer than you meant to be. The crowns feel lighter now, the rituals quieter. And yet when you look closely, the structure is still there, humming softly beneath everything else. Control hasn't vanished. It's just learned how to feel like tradition. Royal weddings no longer announce power the way they once did. They don't need to. Power that survives long enough stops shouting. It settles into habits, expectations, and warm nostalgia. When something is old enough, it stops feeling imposed and starts feeling inherited. That's the final trick. There's a mainstream historical fact that closes the circle. Many royal customs surrounding marriage persist today not because they are legally necessary, but because they are culturally comforting. Continuity itself has become the product. Weddings reassure people that something stable still exists in a world that changes too fast. Control doesn't need force when familiarity does the work. You see it clearly now. The spectacle softened, the language warmed, the pressure diffused, but the underlying lesson remains intact. Marriage, when elevated and ritualized, teaches people how to accept hierarchy without questioning it, not through fear, but through belonging. Here's a final, quietly telling tidbit. Traditions often survive longest when no one can remember who they originally benefited. Once the purpose fades, the structure remains. People defend it, not because it controls them, but because it feels like home. Historians still argue whether modern audiences participate in these rituals knowingly, aware of their manipulative roots, or whether the emotional pull overrides that awareness entirely. Maybe it doesn't matter. Control doesn't require ignorance, only repetition. And you realize something comforting too. Seeing the pattern doesn't mean you're trapped by it. Awareness loosens its grip. When you understand how weddings became tools of control, they lose some of their quiet authority. The spell weakens. The room feels a little larger. Now the pace slows. The noise fades. The story exhales. You're no longer standing in a hall or a crowd or beneath a vaulted ceiling. You're somewhere softer now. The details blur. The sharp edges round off. History doesn't vanish. It settles like dust drifting down after a long day. You don't need to solve anything tonight. You don't need to judge the past or untangle every thread. It's enough to have walked through it, unhurried, noticing what was hidden in plain sight. So let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing deepen. The crowns can stay where they are. The weddings will keep repeating themselves. Whether you watch them or not, you can rest. You've earned it. Now dim the lights a little more. Let the world go quiet. Let the fan hum blend into the dark and drift gently away, knowing the story will still be here tomorrow. But sleep doesn't wait.